2 in the morning. Tessa was changing a patient's bandage at the end of her shift when her phone buzzed. "Craig," she answered, gauze still in hand. "Get your things out of the house by the weekend. Jolene needs the closet." No apology, no explanation. Just an order, like someone calling to cancel a delivery. Tessa set the phone down, went back to dressing the wound. Her hands didn't shake. The next morning she came home, the home she had kept spotless for 3 years, and found another woman had already hung new curtains in the living room. 3 years. 3 years she woke up at 5:45 every morning to prepare her mother-in-law's medication. 3 years she logged every blood sugar reading, memorized 11 pills a day, and never missed a single doctor's appointment. And all she got in return was a phone call at 2 a.m., telling her to pack up. But this story isn't about what Tessa lost. It's about the man she had never met. A man no one in the city dared look in the eye, who would become the first person to see everything she had done in silence, and who would risk everything to keep her by his side. If this story touched you, hit like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded what they do in silence. Someone always sees. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. The front door wasn't locked. That was the first thing Tessa noticed when she stepped into the house the next morning. For 3 years, she had lived here, and she had always locked the front door before going to bed. Always checked the latch on the back door. Always made sure everything stayed exactly where it belonged. Now the door stood wide open, as though the house had belonged to someone else for a long time, and she was only a visitor passing through. In the kitchen, Jolene was making coffee. She was using the white ceramic mug with the blue rim, the mug Tessa had bought at a thrift store during the first year after the wedding, because it fit so comfortably in her hand. Jolene held it as though it had never belonged to anyone else. Craig sat at the dining table, his eyes fixed on his phone, not lifting his head when Tessa walked in. No greeting, no glance. As if she were a delivery woman who had come to the wrong address, Tessa said nothing. She didn't look at Jolene. She didn't look at Craig. She walked straight into the bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled the old backpack down from the top corner. She packed just enough clothes, her identification papers, Miles's birth certificate. Then she opened the drawer of the desk and took out the notebook. It was a thick, hardbound notebook, as wide as a thumb, its corners worn from 3 years of being opened and turned through again and again. Inside was the entire care routine for Dorothy. Every pill, every time slot, every blood sugar reading written in 3 colors of ink, so there would never be a mistake. Tessa had written that notebook by hand during her first month as a daughter-in-law, when she realized that no one in the Palmer family understood Dorothy's illness as well as she did. No one wanted to understand. She slipped the notebook into the backpack, zipped it shut. Craig appeared in the bedroom doorway. He leaned against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest, staring at the backpack. "Leave that notebook here." Tessa stopped, looked up. "My mother needs it," Craig said. His voice was flat, the kind of voice that belonged to someone used to giving orders without needing to explain them. "Jolene will take care of Mom. She needs the notebook." Tessa stood up straight. The backpack was already on her shoulder. She looked at Craig, without looking away, without lowering her head. "I wrote this notebook. I wrote it for 3 years. I sat at that kitchen table, opened every medical record your mother had, checked every medication against every kind of food, and took notes in 3 colors of ink so no one would get confused. I did that alone. No one helped. No one asked. The knowledge in this notebook is mine." Craig opened his mouth. "You want to take care of your mother?" Tessa cut him off. "Then learn it yourself." Craig stood still, not because he respected her answer, but because he had never expected Tessa to be able to say something like that. For the past 3 years, she had always been the one who nodded, the one who arranged things, the one who handled everything in silence. Craig had grown so used to that version of her that he had forgotten silence didn't mean there were no limits. Tessa walked past Craig, her shoulder brushed lightly against his arm. Not on purpose. But she didn't avoid him either. She walked through the living room. New curtains, cream-colored, were already hanging neatly over the windows. Jolene had chosen cream. Tessa had once hung gray curtains because Dorothy said the harsh afternoon light gave her headaches. Jolene didn't know that. Jolene didn't need to know. Jolene only needed the color she liked. In the kitchen, Jolene stood still, the coffee mug raised at chest level. Her smile was still there, but it wasn't as wide as it had been when Tessa first walked in. It had narrowed, thinned, as if for the first time she realized this house wasn't only curtains and closets. There was something heavier here that she hadn't yet seen. Tessa opened the front door, stepped outside. She didn't turn back. She didn't say another word. The door closed behind her, softly, not slammed, not angry, just closed. Craig was still standing in the bedroom doorway, staring at the place where Tessa had just stood. Jolene took a sip of coffee, but she didn't swallow right away. The house suddenly felt quieter than usual, the kind of silence that only happens when the person who kept the rhythm of an entire home has just walked out the door, and the people left behind haven't yet realized the rhythm has stopped. Tessa picked Miles up from the home of a coworker friend who had watched him for her through her overnight shift. The boy was 4 years old, a dinosaur backpack on his back, and he ran out to wrap his arms around his mother's legs without asking why she had come earlier than usual today. She lifted him into the car, then drove 40 minutes toward the suburbs, to Gail's house. Her mother opened the door, looked at the backpack on Tessa's shoulder, looked at Miles dozing in her arms, then said, "Your old room is still exactly the same." She didn't ask anything else. She didn't ask about Craig. She didn't ask what had happened. Gail was the kind of woman who understood everything through what wasn't being said. That night, Miles lay beside Tessa on the twin bed from her high school years. The boy fell asleep quickly. His breathing was steady, soft, warm against her arm. Tessa lay still until she was sure her son was deeply asleep. Then she cried, without making a sound. Tears slid across her temples and down into the pillow, and she let them fall for exactly 1 minute. Then she wiped her face, sat up, opened her laptop, started looking for work. Outside the bedroom door, Gail placed a glass of warm water on the threshold, without knocking, without coming in. The next morning, Tessa saw the glass. The water had gone cold, but she drank it all. Over the next 2 days, she went to interviews at 2 clinics. Both needed nurses for fixed shifts or rotating night shifts. Tessa asked if there were any flexible hours, because she needed to pick up her son at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and had no one to watch Miles in the evenings. The interviewer at the first clinic looked at her with sympathy, but shook his head. The second one didn't bother with sympathy, and only said directly, "We don't have any position that fits your schedule right now." Tessa left the second clinic at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and sat in the car for 10 minutes before starting the engine, not because she wanted to cry, but because she was calculating how many more weeks her savings would last. The answer was 6 weeks. If she stretched every dollar as far as it could go, maybe 8. She didn't have 8 weeks to sit and wait. That evening, after Miles had fallen asleep and Gail had gone back to her room, Tessa's phone rang. An old coworker from a private clinic was calling. "Tessa, I have a case. In home care for a VIP patient. Flexible schedule, mostly daytime, and the pay is 4 times the normal rate." Tessa was silent for 2 seconds. 4 times the pay meant there was a problem. Why is the pay that high? Because no one can last. 6 nurses in 9 months. The longest one stayed 3 weeks. The family is very difficult. I don't know many details, but every clinic has turned down the contract already. What's wrong with the patient? Chronic heart failure with type 2 diabetes. 68 years old. Needs constant medication monitoring, blood sugar control, and a special diet. Tessa closed her eyes. Chronic heart failure. Diabetes. 11 pills a day. Blood sugar readings that needed to be recorded 3 times. A diet that had to be calculated down to every gram. She had done exactly these things for Dorothy for 3 years. Every morning, every afternoon, every night, without missing a single day. "Send me the address," Tessa said. "Tessa, I have to warn you first. This family isn't like a normal family. Security is extremely tight. I'm not sure what they do, but—" "Send me the address," Tessa repeated. Her voice wasn't cold. It was only the voice of someone who no longer had time left for hesitation. She hung up, looked through the bedroom door and saw Miles curled up on the bed, hugging his stuffed dinosaur. 6 weeks of savings, a 4-year-old child, and a job that no one else was willing to do. Tessa didn't have a better choice. But she had one thing the previous 6 nurses didn't. She had spent 3 years living with a difficult patient inside a family where no one bothered to say thank you, and she was still standing here. If the 6 before her had given up, maybe it was because they had never been pushed by life into a place where giving up was no longer a choice. While Tessa was preparing for her new job, on the other side of the city, Jolene stepped into the role of caring for Dorothy with the confidence of someone who had never known that she didn't know anything. She cleaned the kitchen, wiped the table, and arranged the pills into a plastic pill box with 7 compartments that she had bought at the pharmacy near the house. She made Dorothy oatmeal for breakfast, the instant kind, the kind you poured boiling water over, stirred for 2 minutes, and it was done. Fast, neat, convenient. Jolene didn't know that Tessa had never used the instant kind. Dorothy needed slow-cooked oats because instant oatmeal pushed her blood sugar up too quickly, triggering a reaction with the evening dose of medicine. But Jolene didn't know. And Dorothy didn't say anything. She sat at the dining table, looked at the bowl of oatmeal, looked at Jolene, then ate a few spoonfuls without commenting. Jolene smiled, thinking Dorothy had accepted her. Dorothy hadn't accepted her. She was counting. The afternoon pills had been placed in the wrong compartment, the 6th compartment instead of the 5th. The oatmeal was the wrong kind. She counted without speaking, because she had lived long enough to know that there were some people words couldn't change. They weren't wrong because they didn't listen. They were wrong because they didn't know how to see. On the evening of the 4th day, Dorothy called Tessa. It was almost 9 o'clock. Tessa was sitting at Gail's kitchen table, preparing paperwork for her first day at the new place. The phone vibrated. Tessa saw the name on the screen and answered right away. Tessa. Dorothy's voice was weaker than usual. That girl gave me my afternoon medicine at 7 o'clock. Tessa closed her eyes. 7 o'clock. The afternoon medicine had to be taken at 6:15, 45 minutes before dinner, so the active ingredients had enough time to absorb before food entered her stomach. Taking it at 7 meant the medicine met the food at the same time, and Dorothy's stomach would react. I've been nauseous since dinner, Dorothy said. I don't know what to do. Tessa didn't ask anything else. She said immediately, drink 1 glass of warm water, not hot, just warm. Then lie on your left side. Stay in that position for 30 minutes. If you're still nauseous after 30 minutes, eat a few pieces of plain white bread with nothing on them. All right. Silence for 2 seconds. Then Dorothy spoke, so softly that Tessa had to press the phone close to her ear. I miss you, Tessa. Tessa bit her lip. Her hand tightened around the phone. She wanted to say so much, but all she said was, I miss you too. Lie on your left side. I'll call back to check on you in 30 minutes. She kept her word. 30 minutes later, she called again. Dorothy was feeling better. Neither of them said much more. There was only the faint sound of Dorothy's breathing on the other end of the line, and Tessa sitting still, listening, the way she had sat still and listened for 3 years whenever Dorothy needed someone beside her but didn't want to open her mouth and ask. Then, on the 5th night, everything broke open. 2:15 in the morning. Dorothy woke because she was dizzy. She tried to sit up, but her hands were trembling, and she couldn't grip the bed rail. Cold sweat ran down her forehead. She knew this feeling. Low blood sugar. Her body had crashed twice before in the past 3 years, and both times Tessa had handled it within 4 minutes, with the glucose tablets always waiting in the nightstand drawer, in the right place, unexpired. Jolene heard a sound from Dorothy's room. She ran in and saw Dorothy lying on her side, her face pale, sweat soaking the collar of her shirt. Jolene shouted for Craig. No one answered. Craig was sleeping heavily in the next room, his phone on silent, just as it had been every night for the past 3 years, because he had never needed to wake in the middle of the night for his mother. Tessa had taken care of everything. Jolene called 911. Her hands were shaking so badly that she pressed the wrong numbers the first time. The second time, she got through. The dispatcher asked for Dorothy's medical history. Jolene stammered. What medicine was she taking? Jolene didn't know all of it. What dosage? Jolene couldn't remember. Did she have a history of hypoglycemia? Jolene wasn't sure. 8 minutes on the phone with the dispatcher. 8 minutes Tessa would never have needed, because she knew every number, every medication name, every reaction in Dorothy's body as if she knew the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The ambulance arrived. The paramedics checked Dorothy's blood sugar. The reading was dangerous. They injected glucose, stabilized her on the spot, then lifted her onto a stretcher. One of them said to Jolene, if it had been 10 more minutes, this would have been very serious. Jolene stood in the doorway, both arms hanging limp, her face white. Craig appeared in the hallway when the stretcher had already reached the door, his hair messy, his eyes heavy with sleep, wearing the expression of a man who had just been awakened and still didn't understand what was happening inside his own house. Dorothy lay on the stretcher, her face turned to one side. She looked at Jolene. 1 second. Then she closed her eyes. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. That look was enough. The look of a woman who knew very clearly that the girl standing there wasn't someone who could keep her alive through the night. After the night her blood sugar dropped, Dorothy said nothing to Jolene. She didn't scold her. She didn't retell what had happened the night before. She was simply silent, and that silence was heavier than anything she could have said. Jolene thought Dorothy had let it go. Craig thought everything was fine. Both of them were wrong. 2 weeks after the emergency, Dorothy had a follow-up appointment. That appointment was in the hospital system, and before this, Tessa had always received the reminder 3 days ahead of time, written it on the calendar hanging in the kitchen, reminded Dorothy to prepare the night before, then driven her there on time the next morning. Now no one received the reminder. Jolene didn't know the password to the hospital account. Craig didn't know his mother had an appointment. No one asked. That morning, Dorothy woke at 7 o'clock. She put on her wool cardigan, put on her shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed for 5 minutes, waiting for the morning dizziness to pass. Then she stood up, picked up her phone, and called a taxi. Alone. 66 years old, with chronic heart disease, after a low blood sugar episode 2 weeks earlier, and she called a taxi by herself to go to the doctor because no one remembered anymore. Craig discovered that his mother wasn't home at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Her room was empty. Her outdoor shoes weren't on the rack. Her wool cardigan wasn't on the hook. He called Jolene. Jolene said she didn't know. He called his mother's phone. She didn't answer. He called a second time. A third time. No one picked up. Craig drove around the neighborhood, went to the church she often visited, went to the park where she sometimes sat. Nothing. Finally, he called the hospital, and the receptionist said Dorothy Palmer was sitting in the waiting room of the cardiology department, already finished with her appointment, waiting for someone to come pick her up. Craig rushed to the hospital. Dorothy was sitting on a plastic chair in the waiting room, her wool cardigan still buttoned all the way up, her hands resting in her lap, her back straight, calm, as if she had been sitting there her whole life, and there was nothing unusual about it at all. Craig stood in front of his mother, panting, his face red, sweat on his forehead. "Where did you go without telling anyone?" Dorothy looked up. "For 3 years, Tessa took me to my appointments. I never had to call a taxi myself." Craig stood there. He couldn't say anything. Dorothy stood up slowly, bracing one hand against the arm of the chair, not letting Craig help her. She walked out the door ahead of him. That night, the Palmer house exploded. Not Dorothy. She had gone back to her room, closed the door, and stayed silent. The one who exploded was Jolene, 3 weeks of caring for Dorothy. 3 weeks of being watched by silent eyes that she knew were judging her. 3 weeks of hearing Craig mention Tessa's name every time something went wrong. Tessa didn't do it that way. Tessa knew this. Tessa cooked the other kind. Every time that name rang out, Jolene felt herself shrink a little more. "Did you marry me or a nurse?" Jolene screamed. She stood in the middle of the living room, her face red, her hands clenched tight. "I'm not Tessa. I'll never be Tessa. If you want her back, then call her yourself, but don't make me live in her shadow for 1 more day." Craig opened his mouth. Jolene didn't let him speak. "I'm leaving." She took her suitcase, stuffed her things into it. She didn't fold, didn't arrange, just shoved everything in. She dragged the suitcase through the living room, past the cream-colored curtains she had chosen herself 3 weeks earlier, and out the door. No note, no looking back. The sound of the suitcase wheels rolling over the tiled path sounded like someone cutting a straight line through the middle of the house. Craig stood alone in the living room. The cream curtains were still hanging. The kitchen was still messy from dinner. The 7-compartment pillbox sat on the counter. Tomorrow's compartment still empty, because Jolene hadn't had time to fill it. The next week, Craig cared for his mother himself. He went online and searched for instructions on each medication Dorothy was taking. He cooked oatmeal from a recipe he found, but added too much salt, because he didn't know Dorothy needed to control her sodium. He set an alarm for 5:45 in the morning, the same time Tessa used to wake up, but overslept twice in the first 4 days. He forgot the afternoon dose once because he was in a meeting, and thought his mother would remember on her own. Dorothy didn't remember on her own. She hadn't needed to remember on her own for 3 years, because Tessa had always reminded her. At the end of the first week, Craig sat at the kitchen table, his face exhausted, with a pile of notes in front of him. Notes he had written, crossed out, then written again. Dorothy came out of her room, looked at her son, looked at the pile of notes, then looked at the cold bowl of oatmeal sitting on the stove that no one had eaten. She sat down across from Craig. "You're not bad, Craig." Craig looked up. "You just never learned, because there was always someone else doing it for you." She said it gently. Not angry, not sad, just the truth, spoken by someone who had waited far too long to say it. Craig looked at his mother, then looked down at the pile of notes. He didn't answer, because there was nothing to answer. Dorothy was right, and they both knew it. The car stopped in front of an iron gate taller than a person's head. Tessa sat in the back seat, looking through the window. The gate opened slowly, automatically, with no one standing there to press a button. But there were cameras. She counted 3 of them at the front gate alone. The car rolled inside, traveling down a stone-paved drive longer than she had expected. Then it stopped in front of the main entrance. A man in a black suit stepped out. He didn't smile. He didn't greet her. He looked at Tessa, looked down at the clipboard in his hand, then said, "Identification." Tessa handed it over. He checked it, called someone, and said a few words Tessa couldn't quite hear. Then he nodded. "Follow me." "No, please. No, may I? Only follow me." The way someone led another person across a border, where the world on the other side operated by its own laws. The hallway was long, stone floors, high ceilings, so silent that Tessa could hear the sound of her own heels echoing back at her. Then she heard a voice. Low. Even. Not loud, but every syllable was clear, as though the person speaking didn't need to raise his voice because he had never once had to raise it. The man leading her stopped in front of a door left slightly open. Inside was a conference room. A long table, dark wood. 6 men stood around it. No one was sitting. Only one man sat, at the head of the table, his back resting against the chair, both hands placed on the tabletop. Knox Hartwell, 33 years old, black hair, neat, not a single strand out of place. A sharp, angular face, so calm it was hard to guess what he was thinking. His gaze wasn't cold, and it wasn't warm. It was simply awake, completely awake. The kind of awake that belonged to a man who never allowed himself to lose his guard, not even for half a second. One of the 6 men standing across from Knox had both arms hanging at his sides, his eyes fixed on the floor. He was being questioned. Or, more accurately, he was being given a chance to speak. "I'm giving you a chance to explain. One time," Knox said. His voice wasn't threatening. It was worse than threatening. It was ordinary. Ordinary the way a person read a menu. And it was that very ordinariness that made everyone in the room afraid to breathe too loudly. The man stammered through a few sentences. Tessa stood outside the door and couldn't hear the details clearly, but she could hear the tremor in his voice. Knox listened until he was finished. No reaction, no nod, no shake of the head. He only looked toward the assistant standing on his right and gave one slight nod. The assistant stepped forward. The man who had violated the rules was escorted out. No one said anything else. No one needed to say anything else. The 5 remaining men stood still. Knox turned toward the door and saw Tessa. She stood at the threshold, her medical backpack on her shoulder, her hair tied neatly back, her face without makeup. She didn't avoid Knox's eyes. She didn't try to look tough either. She simply stood there, calm, the same way she stood in an emergency room at 2 o'clock in the morning when a patient's blood pressure was dropping and everyone around her was shouting. She was used to rooms filled with pressure. This room was only different because the pressure came from one person instead of a machine. Knox looked at her. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. "The 7th nurse," he said. "The one before you cried in the parking lot on the 2nd day." Tessa didn't blink. "I don't cry in parking lots. I already cried at home." The conference room grew even quieter than before. The 5 men looked at Tessa as if she had just done something none of them would have dared to imagine, let alone do, answered Knox without trembling, without lowering her head, without adding sir or sorry at the end of the sentence. Knox didn't smile, but his gaze lingered on Tessa for a fraction longer than the way he looked at anyone else in the room. Then he turned to his assistant. "Take her up to see my mother." The assistant nodded. Tessa followed him. She didn't look back at Knox. She didn't need to. She had understood enough in the last 30 seconds. The man sitting at the head of that table wasn't the kind of person who shouted when he was angry. He was the kind of person whose silence was more frightening than anyone else's scream, and she had just spoken to him without shaking. A wide staircase led up to the second floor, another hallway, then a closed wooden door. The assistant knocked twice. From inside, a woman's voice rang out. Clear. Sharp. Not inviting them in, but questioning. "Who is it?" "The new nurse, ma'am." 3 seconds of silence. "Come in." Tessa stepped into the room. The wooden door closed behind her. The room was spacious, natural light pouring through the large windows. But Tessa didn't look at the room. She looked at the woman sitting in the armchair beside the window. Margaret Hartwell, 68 years old. Short silver hair, neatly cut. Her back straight even though she was sitting in a soft chair. Both hands rested on the arms of the chair, not because she needed support, but because that was the posture of someone used to sitting in a position where she judged others. Her eyes were sharp, not clouded by age at all. She looked Tessa over from head to toe, not quickly, not slowly, at exactly the pace that made the person being watched feel as though every detail of her body was being read. "What do you know about stage 3 heart failure?" No greeting, no asking her name, no invitation to sit. The first question was a test. The 6 nurses before her had probably answered with a textbook definition. Ejection fraction under 40%. Shortness of breath with light exertion. Limited physical activity. Correct. But correct in the way of someone reciting a lesson, not someone who had lived beside it. Tessa didn't open a book in her mind. She opened 3 years. Stage 3 heart failure means you'll feel fine in the morning and think you can do everything. But by afternoon, your body will betray you. You'll be tired without understanding why. Because in the morning you were clearly all right. You'll snap at the people around you. Not because you want to, but because exhaustion turns every small thing into something large. The evening medication needs to be taken at least 45 minutes before a meal. But if you feel nauseous after dinner, the problem isn't the medicine, it's the timing. I cared for a heart failure patient for 3 years. During the first month, she felt nauseous every evening. I moved her medication time from 6:30 to 6:15. 15 minutes. Only 15 minutes. She wasn't nauseous anymore, not because I'm good, because I was there long enough to notice. Margaret said nothing. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Tessa stood still, adding nothing, taking nothing back. She had said what she knew, not to impress anyone, but because it was the truth, and truth didn't need decoration. "Sit down," Margaret said. 2 words. Tessa pulled the small chair beside the bed and sat down. She didn't know that none of the 6 nurses before her had ever heard those 2 words. The first had been dismissed after 40 minutes because she looked at her phone more than she looked at me. The second had been dismissed after 2 days for giving her cold water. The third lasted 2 weeks but cried when Margaret asked why she didn't know the name of the medication she was giving her. The 4th through the 6th, none of them made it past the first question that Margaret considered enough to say, "Sit down." Tessa sat down and began to work. The first thing she did wasn't check blood pressure or measure heart rate. She went straight to the medicine cabinet. Professional habit. 3 years with Dorothy had taught her that the medicine cabinet was the map of a patient's health. By looking inside the medicine cabinet, she knew who was taking care of the patient, how they were doing it, and whether they were doing it correctly. She opened the cabinet. 11 medications, arranged in labeled plastic containers. She took each box out, read the name, and checked it against the prescription the clinic had sent with the file. She read from top to bottom. Then she stopped. The evening dose, a small white tablet, green labeled box. The doctor's prescription said 20 milligrams. Inside the box were 40 milligram tablets. Tessa looked back at the prescription, looked back at the box. Read the label on the blister pack again. No mistake. The dose in the cabinet was twice the dose the doctor had prescribed. And judging from the amount of medication left in the box, this wrong dose had been given for at least 3 months. 6 nurses. 3 months. No one had opened the prescription and checked it against the original order. No one had noticed. Tessa closed the cabinet, went downstairs, knocked on the door of Knox's office. The assistant opened the door and looked at her in surprise, because no nurse had ever gone to Knox's office on her own on the first day. Tessa said, "I need to speak with Mr. Hartwell about Margaret's medication, right now." Knox was sitting in the room. He listened as Tessa spoke. She presented it briefly. The prescription said 20 milligrams. The medicine cabinet contained 40 milligram tablets. The wrong dose had been given for at least 3 months. They needed to call the doctor to confirm it and change the medication immediately. Knox didn't ask twice. He didn't doubt her. He picked up the phone and called the family's private doctor. The call lasted 4 minutes. The doctor confirmed that Tessa was right. The dose had been wrong since the refill 3 months earlier because the pharmacy had packaged it incorrectly, and no nurse had discovered it because no one had checked it against the original prescription. Knox hung up, looked at Tessa. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say, well done. He turned to the assistant standing beside him and said, increase her access to the medicine cabinet. Full access. No limits. The assistant nodded and wrote it down. Tessa stood, then turned back toward the stairs and headed up to Margaret's room. She didn't say anything more. She didn't need Knox to thank her. She needed Margaret to take the right medication. The rest didn't matter. But Knox remained seated in his office for several minutes after Tessa left. He looked at the door she had just walked through. None of the 6 before her had opened the medicine cabinet to check it on the first day. None of the 6 before her had come down to his office and said, right now, in a voice that sounded as though she was giving him an order, not the other way around. He didn't know what to call that. But he knew one thing. His mother had just said, sit down to her. And that was something she hadn't said to anyone in the past 9 months. During Tessa's first week at the Hartwell mansion, she didn't try to make Margaret like her. She simply worked. Morning blood pressure, blood sugar readings before and after meals, medication checks, meals prepared according to the diet the doctor had prescribed after Tessa discovered the wrong dosage. She did everything quietly, precisely, and without asking Margaret whether she was satisfied, because she knew that people like Margaret didn't judge through praise. They judged by not sending you away. On the 3rd day, Tessa noticed a pattern. Every afternoon, around 3 o'clock, Margaret became irritable. She snapped at the assistant because the footsteps in the hallway were too loud. She pushed the glass of water toward the edge of the table because the water isn't the right temperature. She closed her eyes, gripped the arms of the chair tightly, and didn't want anyone to speak to her. The previous nurses had probably thought she was difficult in the afternoon. Tessa didn't think so. She looked at the medication schedule. The noon dose was at 12 o'clock. The next dose was at 6:15 in the evening, a gap of 6 hours. For someone with diabetes and heart failure, 6 hours without food between 2 doses of medicine was too long. Her blood sugar was dropping, not low enough to become dangerous, but low enough for her body to respond with fatigue, irritation, and discomfort. Margaret wasn't snapping because of her temperament. She was snapping because her body was running low on energy, and no one had noticed. On the 4th day, at 2:45 in the afternoon, 15 minutes before the usual irritation began, Tessa knocked on Margaret's door. She carried a small plate with her, 1 slice of rye bread spread with peanut butter. Not much. Just enough to keep her blood sugar stable without affecting the evening dose. I didn't ask for food, Margaret said, looking at the plate. I know, Tessa said, placing the plate on the table beside the chair. But your body is asking for it. Margaret looked at Tessa, then looked at the plate, then ate. She didn't say thank you. That afternoon, she didn't snap at anyone. She didn't push the glass of water away. She didn't grip the arms of the chair. The assistant walked past the hallway at 4 o'clock, her footsteps just as loud as they were every day, and Margaret didn't say a word. On the 5th day, at 2:45, Tessa knocked again. Rye bread with peanut butter. Margaret looked at the plate, said nothing, and ate. The 6th day was the same. From then on, 2:45 in the afternoon became a fixed point that both of them understood without needing to say it out loud. Margaret didn't thank her. But she also didn't send Tessa away. In Margaret's world, not being sent away was the highest form of recognition. At the end of the first week, Knox came to his mother's room. He knocked, stepped inside, and looked around. Margaret was sitting in her armchair, reading a book. Tessa was recording the afternoon blood sugar reading in the notebook. Knox stood in the middle of the room, both hands in his trouser pockets, looking at his mother, then at Tessa, then back at his mother again, with the expression of a man trying to look natural when everyone could clearly see he wasn't natural at all. "How are you feeling, Mom?" "Same as always," Margaret answered without lifting her eyes from the book. Knox turned to Tessa. "I want to change the evening medication time. Move it up to 5:30 instead of 6:15. My mother sleeps late. I want her to sleep earlier." Tessa stopped writing, looked at Knox. "No." One word. The room fell silent. The assistant standing outside the door, who had been scrolling on her phone, snapped her head up. Margaret lowered the book into her lap. "I don't take medical orders from you," Tessa said. Her voice wasn't cold, and it wasn't warm. It was the voice of someone stating the truth and seeing no reason to apologize for it. "You pay my salary, but my patient is Margaret, not you." Her evening medication time was prescribed by her doctor based on her metabolic rhythm, not based on the bedtime you want. You want to change the medication time, you talk to the doctor. If the doctor agrees, I'll do it. If the doctor doesn't agree, I won't, no matter who you are. The last 3 words hung in the air. No matter who you are. The assistant held her breath. In this mansion, no one said that to Knox. Not subordinates, not partners, not lawyers. Knox Hartwell was the person who gave orders, and everyone around him existed to carry those orders out. No one had ever stood in front of him and said no without trembling. Knox looked at Tessa, not angry, not red-faced. He was simply processing a situation he had never encountered before, and he needed a few seconds to find the proper response. "Fine," he said. Then he turned, walked out, the door closed behind him. Margaret looked after her son, then looked at Tessa, then picked up her book, turned to a new page, and said without looking up, "This girl refused my son in broad daylight." Tessa didn't answer. She continued recording the reading in the notebook. "I like this girl," Margaret added, and the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. Just a little, but the assistant standing outside the door saw it clearly, because it was the first time in months that Margaret Hartwell had shown something close to a smile. Margaret's afternoon blood sugar reading that day was 12 points higher than normal. Not much. Not enough to raise an alarm. But Tessa looked at that number and didn't like it. A 12-point deviation in a healthy person was a small thing. A 12-point deviation in someone with stage 3 heart failure and diabetes, taking 11 different medications, with a dose that had just been adjusted after 3 months of being wrong, was a signal she didn't want to ignore. 3 years with Dorothy had taught her one thing. A patient's body spoke before the patient did, and that 12-point deviation meant Margaret's body was saying something. Tessa was supposed to end her shift at 6 o'clock in the evening. She stayed. She didn't ask Knox for permission. She didn't notify the assistant. She simply remained in Margaret's room, pretending to rearrange the medicine cabinet, while in truth, she was waiting for the blood sugar reading after dinner, waiting to see how Margaret's body would respond to the new medication dose, waiting for the number to say something more. Margaret didn't ask why Tessa was still there. She only looked at her once, then went back to reading. In Margaret's world, the person who stayed didn't need to explain. The person who left did. 9:42 at night. Margaret set her book down. Her hand moved to her chest. She said nothing. It was only her hand moving to her chest, and Tessa saw it. "Are you short of breath?" Tessa stood up at once. Margaret nodded. Slightly. Her breathing had shortened. She wasn't gasping, but each breath took more effort than the one before it. Her lips had turned a little pale. Her left hand gripped the arm of the chair. Tessa didn't shout. She didn't run outside to call someone. She went straight to Margaret, placed her fingers on Margaret's wrist, and counted her pulse. Faster than usual. Irregular. She turned to the bedside table and picked up the blood pressure monitor she had placed there herself on the first day. She wrapped the cuff around Margaret's arm and pressed the button. The machine ran. The reading appeared. Systolic pressure high, diastolic pressure low, a wide gap. Tessa memorized both numbers. "Lie on your left side," Tessa said softly, both hands helping Margaret from a seated position to a lying position on the bed. She adjusted the pillows so Margaret's head was higher than her chest, pulled the blanket up just enough. Every movement was quick, precise, and without waste. Outside, the night nurse heard the noise and rushed in. She saw Margaret lying on the bed, her face pale, while Tessa was taking her blood pressure for the second time. The night nurse panicked, turned toward the hallway, and called Knox. Tessa didn't know Knox was being called. She didn't care who was being called. She picked up her phone and dialed Margaret's private doctor, the number she had saved on the first day. The doctor answered. Tessa said, "Margaret Hartwell. Stage 3 heart failure. Sudden onset shortness of breath at 9:42. First blood pressure reading, 158/72. Second reading after 3 minutes, 161/69. Pulse 98. Irregular. This afternoon's blood sugar was 12 points above range. The evening medication dose was adjusted last week. She is lying on her left side, head elevated. I suspect early-stage acute pulmonary edema. The doctor said he would arrive in 20 minutes. Tessa hung up, turned back to Margaret, checked her breathing, counted, recorded it, placed her hand on the back of Margaret's hand. Warm, not cold yet. Good. Knox arrived at the room within 4 minutes after the night nurse's call. He had run, perhaps for the first time in many years that Knox Hartwell had run for anything. He reached the doorway and stopped. Inside, Tessa was sitting beside his mother's bed. One hand held a pen, writing readings into the notebook. The other rested on Margaret's wrist, counting her pulse. Her face was calm, not tense, not afraid. Calm in the way only people who had stood beside the line between stable and unstable enough times could be. Margaret lay on her side, eyes closed, but her breathing was steadier than before. The pillow was placed correctly. The blanket was placed correctly. The blood pressure monitor was still wrapped around her arm, ready for the third reading. Knox stood at the door. He didn't step inside. He didn't say anything. He looked at Tessa, looked at his mother, looked at the way the room was operating under the hands of one person, without anyone needing to give orders, without anyone needing to coordinate. The night nurse stood behind Knox, panting because she had just run to call him. She looked into the room, then looked at Knox, waiting for him to say something. Knox didn't speak. He only stood there. The doctor arrived 17 minutes later. He examined Margaret, confirmed that Tessa's suspicion was right. Very early stage pulmonary edema, caught in time. He adjusted the medication on the spot. Margaret stabilized. The doctor said that if it hadn't been discovered until morning, the situation would have been much more complicated. The doctor left. The night nurse came in to take over the shift. Tessa cleaned up the instruments, washed her hands, and wrote the last line in the notebook. She walked toward the door. Knox was still standing in the hallway. The two of them looked at each other. Tessa gave a small nod, the kind of nod exchanged between colleagues when a shift had ended. Then she walked past him, down the stairs, and out the door. Knox remained in the hallway for a while longer, then he stepped into his mother's room. Margaret was asleep. Her breathing was even. The pillow was in the right place. Tessa's notebook lay on the bedside table, open to the final page, the last line recording the time and the third blood pressure reading. The handwriting was clear, neat, written by a hand that hadn't shaken. Perry Wade appeared for the first time during Tessa's second week at the mansion. He knocked on Margaret's door at 10 o'clock in the morning, poked his head in, smiled broadly, and said, "Hello, Mrs. Margaret. I stopped by to visit you." Margaret looked at him, gave a slight nod, then went back to reading. Perry didn't enter the room. He turned to Tessa, who was standing at the table preparing the noon medication, and held out his hand. "Perry Wade, I've worked with Knox for 10 years. You're the new nurse, right? I heard you've lasted more than a week. That's a record." Tessa shook his hand. Perry had an easy smile, a relaxed voice, and the way of standing that belonged to someone familiar with every corner of this mansion. He belonged here. Tessa saw that in the way the guards nodded when he passed, in the way Knox's assistant spoke to him as an equal, instead of with the kind of respect reserved for Knox. Perry Wade was the number 2 man, and the number 2 man always knew everything the number 1 man didn't have time to know. In the days that followed, Perry stopped by Margaret's room more often. Not for long. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. He asked about her, said a few things to Tessa, then left. The conversations were always light. How is Mrs. Margaret today? Is there anything special on her schedule today? What time does she usually take her nap? Ordinary questions. Ordinary concern. From someone who had been beside the Hartwell family for 10 years. But in the 3rd week, Perry asked one question that made Tessa pause. What time does the security team change shifts? I want to know so I don't call the wrong person when I need to get in touch. The question made sense. The reason made sense. But Tessa realized Perry had asked it on that exact Wednesday, the day she had seen the security team change shifts 30 minutes later than usual because someone was out sick. If Perry had worked with Knox for 10 years, he knew the shift change schedule very well. He didn't need to ask. Unless he was trying to confirm today's shift change schedule, this specific day, not the general schedule. Tessa didn't react. She answered, "I'm not very sure. You should ask the security team directly. That would probably be more accurate." Perry smiled. Right. I'll ask them then. Then he left. Tessa stood in the doorway of Margaret's room, watching Perry walk down the hall. She didn't have a clear thought yet. It was only instinct. The same way she had looked at a blood sugar reading that was 12 points off and known something wasn't quite right. It wasn't proof. It was only a feeling, but she had lived with that feeling long enough to know she shouldn't ignore it. That evening, at Gail's apartment, after Miles had fallen asleep, Tessa opened a new notebook. Not the care notebook. A private notebook. She wrote down every question Perry had asked her over the past 2 weeks. What day, what time, what he asked. She wrote down the times she had seen strangers outside the mansion gate, twice the week before, both times in the late afternoon. She drew 2 parallel columns. The left column was the day Perry asked. The right column was the day there was a stranger. 2 out of 3 times matched. It could be a coincidence. It could be not. Tessa didn't know for sure. And because she didn't know for sure, she didn't tell Knox. If she spoke without hard evidence and was wrong, she would lose her job and the trust Knox had placed in her. If she was right but spoke too soon, Perry would know she suspected him and change the way he worked. She chose another way. She would change everything Perry might be relying on, without letting Perry know why. The next morning, Tessa met Knox in his office. She said, "I suggest moving Mrs. Margaret's room from the 2nd floor to the 1st floor." Knox looked at her. "Why?" "The stairs are the greatest risk for a patient with heart failure. After last week's shortness of breath episode, Mrs. Margaret shouldn't be going up and down the stairs every day unless it's necessary. The room on the 1st floor is closer to the back entrance. If there's an emergency, an ambulance can reach her 3 minutes faster than it could on the 2nd floor. 3 minutes with acute pulmonary edema is the difference between stabilizing her on site and needing intubation." Every reason was true. Every number was accurate. Knox had no reason to refuse. "Fine, arrange it." Tessa nodded, walked out. She didn't tell Knox that moving Margaret's room would break every piece of information Perry had gathered about where she was, about the route from the stairs to her room, about which direction her bedroom window faced. If Perry was planning something aimed at Margaret, that plan had just been completely disrupted, and Perry had no idea, because the reason Tessa had given was medical, and in the Hartwell mansion, no one questioned a medical reason from the nurse Knox himself had given full access to the medicine cabinet. That afternoon, Margaret was moved down to a room on the 1st floor. She looked around the new room, looked at Tessa arranging the medication on the shelf, then said, "You didn't move me down here only because of the stairs." Tessa stopped, looked at her. "The stairs are the main reason," Tessa said. Not quickly, not slowly, at exactly the right rhythm. Margaret looked at her for 3 more seconds, then nodded. Fine. She didn't ask anything else. But her eyes said she knew. She was 68 years old, and she had lived through enough to recognize when someone was protecting her without wanting to say it out loud. The court papers arrived at Gail's house on a Tuesday afternoon. Tessa was washing dishes after lunch, and Miles was in the living room doing a puzzle with his grandmother. The doorbell rang. Tessa dried her hands and opened the door. A man in a suit, carrying a black leather briefcase, handed her a large brown envelope. "Tessa Grant?" She nodded. He gave her the envelope, asked her to sign for it, then turned away without saying anything else. Tessa stood in the doorway and opened the envelope. A petition from Craig Palmer filed with Family Court, requesting scheduled visitation rights with their son. The reason written in the petition was that the mother currently had no stable place to live, was working for a family connected to unclear business activities, and was in an environment unsuitable for a small child. Tessa read every line. Her hand didn't shake, but she bit her lip so hard it almost hurt. Craig wasn't asking for custody of Miles. He was asking for visitation. But she understood this wasn't because Craig missed his son. This was the way he would pull her back into his circle of control. If the court granted Craig scheduled visitation, she would have to arrange her schedule around him, see him, and communicate with him. The cord she had cut would be tied back together. She folded the papers, pushed them back into the envelope, and put it in the kitchen drawer. Miles didn't know. Gail didn't know. Tessa closed the drawer and went back to finishing the dishes. But Knox knew. Tessa didn't tell Knox. She didn't talk about private matters at work. But the security system Knox had arranged around Tessa after the night she stayed late to save Margaret wasn't only 2 men guarding the mansion gate. Knox had people monitoring the security around Gail's house, and the man who delivered the court papers wearing a suit and carrying a black leather briefcase, had been clearly recorded on camera while standing at the front door. Knox's assistant reported it within 2 hours. That afternoon, while Tessa was taking Margaret's blood pressure, Knox knocked on the door. He stepped inside, waited for Tessa to finish the reading, then said, "I know about the court papers." Tessa stopped, looked at Knox. "I'll have my lawyer help you." "No need," Tessa said quickly. Her voice was flat, but firm. "I don't need you to solve my problems for me. This is my family matter." Knox didn't look offended. He also didn't step back. He looked at Tessa and said, "I'm not solving your problem. I'm making sure the 4-year-old boy doing puzzles at his grandmother's house doesn't get dragged into an adult fight. That's my principle. Children don't take part in wars they didn't start." Tessa was silent. She looked at Knox, and for 1 second, she saw in him something she hadn't seen in Craig in 3 years. Principle. Not a promise, because promises could be swallowed back. A principle was something a person lived by even when no one was watching. "All right," Tessa said, "but your lawyer works with me, not instead of me." "Of course." Knox's lawyer filed the response within 4 days. Tessa provided evidence: a legal employment contract, stable income, a residential address at Gail's house, a clear care schedule for Miles, and confirmation from the preschool that Miles attended regularly, was healthy, and was happy. The court reviewed the petition and rejected Craig's request. The reason was insufficient basis to prove that the mother's living environment was harmful to the child. Craig lost. But Craig was the kind of man who didn't know when to stop. He found out that Tessa was working for the Hartwell family, and one Friday afternoon, he drove to the mansion gate. The guards stopped him. Craig demanded to see Tessa. The guards called inside. Knox didn't go out to the gate. He didn't need to go out to the gate. He called Craig directly. Knox had Craig's phone number within 10 minutes after his assistant reported it. Craig answered, his voice aggressive. "I want to see my wife." "Ex-wife," Knox said. His voice was ordinary, slow, even, the kind of voice the listener had to make an effort to hear, because he never raised it. "Mr. Palmer, I know you. I know more than you think. You have a small construction business on the south side of the city, and you owe the bank $412,000. That debt comes due in 4 months. You're asking for an extension, but the bank hasn't approved it because your cash flow isn't convincing enough. Your main partner is Mr. Brennan's materials company in District 8. Mr. Brennan is looking for a new partner because you've been late on payment 3 times in a row." Craig was silent on the other end of the line. "1 call from me," Knox continued, "and the bank calls in the debt tomorrow morning. 2 calls, and Mr. Brennan signs with someone else tomorrow afternoon. I'm not saying this to scare you, Palmer. I'm explaining consequences. Very specific, very easy to understand." "What do you want?" Craig asked. His voice emptied of all the aggression it had held 30 seconds earlier. "I want you to drive away from my gate within 2 minutes. I want you to handle matters with Tessa through lawyers, through the court, and according to the law. Don't go to Gail's house. Don't go to the boys' school. Don't come here. If you want to see your son, you follow the proper process. If you want to pressure Tessa, you're pressuring me." Knox paused for 1 second. "And you aren't capable of withstanding pressure from me." The line went silent for 5 seconds. Then came the sound of an engine starting, the sound of tires turning over gravel. The security camera recorded Craig Palmer's car leaving the Hartwell mansion gate at 4:17 in the afternoon. He didn't come back. He didn't call again. He didn't send a lawyer again. Tessa didn't learn about that call until several weeks later. Knox didn't tell her, because Knox didn't protect people in order to be thanked. He protected them because it was his principle, and principles didn't need an audience. Perry knew, not because Tessa had said or done anything wrong, but because Tessa was doing too many things right, and those right things were tightening around him. Margaret's room had been moved down to the 1st floor. Her schedule had changed. Her garden time had shifted from 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 3. The new bedroom faced a different direction, had different windows, a different path. Everything Perry had memorized over the past few months had suddenly become useless, and the only person who had changed all of it was the new nurse who had been there less than a month. Perry didn't know for certain whether Tessa suspected him or whether she was simply an overly careful nurse, but Perry wasn't the kind of man who waited to find out the answer. In his world, suspicion and certainty were handled the same way. Quickly, before it had time to become a problem. Tessa left the mansion at 7:15 on Thursday evening. Miles had been at Gail's house since the afternoon, after Gail picked him up from preschool at 4 o'clock. Tessa drove home alone, on the 20-minute stretch through a quiet suburban area with little traffic. It was already dark. The streetlights were sparse. She turned on soft music, both hands on the steering wheel, her mind still thinking about Margaret's afternoon blood sugar reading, slightly higher than she wanted. She didn't see the car behind her until its headlights shone straight into her rearview mirror. Close. Too close. She blinked her signal to let the car pass. It didn't pass. It moved closer. Then it pulled out to the left. She thought it was going to overtake her, but it didn't. It pressed in. Slowly, steadily, deliberately. Tessa's steering wheel was forced to the right. She tried to hold it. The wheel shook. Her car slid out of the lane, the right front tire hitting the low concrete divider along the shoulder. The car jerked violently. The airbag burst open. Tessa slammed into the right side window. Then everything stopped. Silence. The car sat tilted, half on the shoulder, half on the sidewalk. The engine was off. The headlights were still on, shining into the roadside bushes. The other car was gone. It didn't stop. It didn't turn back. Tessa sat inside the car, her left shoulder aching, the right side of her forehead burning. She lifted a hand and touched her forehead. A long scrape caught in her hair. Her left shoulder couldn't move completely, probably from the impact when the car jerked. She tried to open the door. It was jammed. She tried the left door. It opened. She crawled out of the car and sat down hard on the sidewalk. Her legs were trembling slightly, but her head was clear. Completely clear. She knew it wasn't an accident. The car had pressed in slowly, steadily, from the left, on the exact stretch with no cameras, no houses, no witnesses. It was planned. Tessa held her phone. The screen was cracked, but it was still lit. She opened her contacts. Her finger stopped on 911, then slid upward, stopped on another name, Knox. She didn't think about why, didn't analyze it, didn't weigh it. Her finger called Knox before her mind could even ask why she was calling him instead of emergency services. Maybe because emergency services could only handle the scrape. Knox could handle the person who caused the scrape. Knox answered after the first ring. Tessa? I was in a car accident, on the suburban road, about 15 minutes south of the mansion. I'm okay. A scrape on my forehead and my shoulder. Miles is at Gail's house, safe. Tessa's voice was calm, but weaker than usual. She paused, then added one more sentence. It wasn't an accident. The line went silent. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which Tessa could clearly hear Knox breathing on the other end, and she knew he was processing the information, rearranging everything in his head, connecting every piece. Then Knox spoke, not to Tessa, to someone beside him. 2 words. Find Perry. His voice didn't shout. It didn't shake. It didn't rise. But Tessa heard the sound of someone stepping back on the other end of the phone. Knox's assistant had heard those 2 words, and his first reaction was to take 1 step back, not because he feared the volume, but because he feared the level of calm. When Knox Hartwell was that calm, it meant someone was about to lose everything. Where are you exactly? Knox said, turning back to Tessa. Tessa read out the street name. Knox hung up. 11 minutes later, a black car stopped beside Tessa's car. Before the ambulance, before the police. Knox stepped out. He walked quickly, but he didn't run. Every step controlled. But Tessa saw his hand clenched tight at his side, and she knew that control was holding back a great deal. Knox opened Tessa's car door and looked inside, looked at the steering wheel, looked at the deflated airbag, then looked at Tessa, sitting on the sidewalk, her back against a streetlight pole, the scrape on her forehead, her left shoulder hanging slightly lower than the right. He said nothing. He didn't ask, "Are you okay?" He didn't ask, "What happened?" He took off his coat, stepped over, sat down beside Tessa, and placed the coat over her shoulders. The fabric was warm. It smelled of wood and coffee. Tessa didn't realize she was cold until the coat touched her skin. Knox looked at the scrape on Tessa's forehead. 3 seconds. Then he stood and held out his hand. "Can you stand?" Tessa took his hand, stood up. Knox led her to his car, opened the door, waited until she sat down, closed it, walked around to the driver's seat. The car began to move. Tessa sat in the passenger seat, Knox's coat still over her shoulders, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't cry. She wasn't shaking anymore. She only sat there, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed someone else to take her somewhere safe without needing to find the way herself. Knox didn't look for Perry right away that night. He took Tessa to the hospital first, waited for the doctor to examine her, waited for the imaging results on her shoulder, waited until the scrape on Tessa's forehead had been bandaged. Only after everything was finished did he bring Tessa back to the mansion, hand her over to the night nurse for observation, then return to his office, closed the door, sat down, and began to work. Knox's assistant took 4 hours to gather everything. The recording of the call between Perry and Nelson Kane, taken from the listening system Knox had installed in the phones of everyone close to him many years earlier. Perry knew that system existed, but he had used a second phone. He didn't know Knox also knew about the second phone. Beside the call recording were photographs of Tessa's crash scene, taken by Knox's security team 15 minutes after Knox left. And the last thing was the small notebook Tessa had handed to Knox in the car when he took her to the hospital. She had pulled the notebook from her coat pocket, placed it on Knox's lap, and said, "I started writing it down in the second week." What Perry asked, "On which day?" compared with the days strangers appeared around the mansion. "I didn't have hard evidence, so I didn't say anything. But now you have enough." The next morning, Knox called Perry to his office. 10 o'clock in the morning. Knox's voice over the phone was normal. "Stop by my office. There's something we need to discuss." Perry came. On time. Just like he had every time over the past 10 years. He knocked on the door, walked in, and smiled. The smile he had used for 10 years. The smile no one had ever questioned. Knox sat behind the desk. 2 glasses of whiskey had already been poured. He pushed one glass toward Perry. "Sit." Perry sat, picked up the glass, took a sip. "What's going on?" Knox didn't answer right away. He spoke casually, asked about last week's shipment, asked about the meeting with the partner in District 6, asked whether Perry wanted to take a few days off, because he looked tired lately. Perry answered each question easily, naturally, because he had no reason not to feel at ease. He thought Knox didn't know. He thought the car that had forced Tessa off the road looked like an accident. He thought he was safe. Then Knox stopped talking. He opened the desk drawer, took out 3 things, and placed them on the wooden surface, one by one, slowly. First, a photograph of Tessa's car tilted on the roadside, headlights still on, the airbag already deflated. Second, a printed record of the call between Perry and Nelson Kane, with the date, time, duration, and a summary of the contents. Third, Tessa's small notebook, open to the page with 2 parallel columns. The left column, the dates Perry had asked Tessa questions. The right column, the dates strangers had appeared around the mansion. The matching lines were circled in red ink. Perry looked at the photograph, then at the call record, then at the notebook. The glass of whiskey in his hand stopped halfway, neither set down nor raised. His face changed, slowly, as though color were being drawn out of his skin, paler, gradually, gradually, gradually. Knox looked at Perry, not quickly, not slowly, at exactly the right rhythm. 10 years, Knox said. "I trusted you for 10 years, Perry. You sat at my family's dinner table every Sunday. You called my mother Mrs. Margaret. You knew I drank black coffee with no sugar every morning. You knew I couldn't sleep unless I checked the camera in my mother's room. You knew the password to my phone, knew the name of my mother's private doctor, even knew the brand of medication she took every evening." Knox stopped. 1 second. "And you used all of that to join hands with Nelson Kane. You had people watching my mansion. You tried to draw out my mother's schedule through a nurse who was trying to rebuild her life after her husband threw her out. And when she began to notice you, you had a car force her into a divider at 7 o'clock at night on a stretch of road where no one was around." Perry opened his mouth. No sound came out. Knox stood up, slowly, both hands braced on the desk. He didn't lean toward Perry. He simply stood straight, and his shadow stretched long across the tabletop, covering the photograph, the record, the notebook, and even the glass of whiskey Perry was holding. "You have 2 hours to disappear from this city. 2 hours. I'm not calling the police because the police won't handle this fast enough for me. I'm not calling anyone else because I don't want my mother to hear your name one more time. 2 hours, Perry. After 2 hours, I don't guarantee anything. And you know me. You know what I mean when I say I don't guarantee anything. Perry set the glass down on the desk. His hand shook so badly that the glass tapped against the wood with a small clicking sound. He stood, said nothing, didn't apologize, didn't explain, because he knew there was no apology large enough for 10 years of betrayal, and no explanation Knox wanted to hear. Perry walked to the door. His legs were unsteady. The door of Knox's office closed behind him with a soft click. That click was the final sound of 10 years. That night, Perry Wade disappeared from the city. His apartment was empty. Both of his phones were turned off. His car was no longer in the parking lot. No one in Knox's system saw him again, and no one asked. 2 o'clock in the morning. The mansion was silent. The kind of silence that only came after something had been cut away, and the empty space hadn't yet had time to be filled. Perry had been gone for 8 hours. The room he had used on the ground floor had been cleared out, his personal belongings gone, the keys left on the table. 10 years folded into one empty room, and one ring of keys. Knox sat in the kitchen, alone. In front of him was a cup of black coffee. No sugar, made by the machine. But he had ground the beans himself, because at 2 o'clock in the morning, there was no one there to make it for him. Perry used to make it, every morning, for 10 years. Perry knew Knox drank black coffee with no sugar, knew he liked a medium roast, knew he didn't drink from a large cup because he took small sips while reading the morning reports. Perry knew everything, and Perry had betrayed him anyway. Knox took a sip of coffee. It was more bitter than usual. Maybe because he had ground the beans too long, maybe because the problem wasn't the coffee beans. Light footsteps sounded on the stairs. Tessa came down. She was wearing a long sweater, her right hand holding an empty cup, her left shoulder still bandaged. She walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, and filled the cup with water. Then she turned back and saw Knox. The two of them looked at each other in the dark kitchen, with only the yellow light above the stove falling down between them. Tessa didn't ask, "Are you all right?" She had understood enough about Knox to know that question had no place here. She pulled out the chair across from Knox, sat down, and placed her cup of water on the table. Silence. Knox looked at the coffee cup. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. Then he spoke, not looking at Tessa, only looking down at the coffee. "Perry came to me when he was 19. No home, no family. He slept in the back seat of his truck and ate leftovers from my restaurant. I saw him one night, sitting outside by the trash behind the kitchen, eating half a box of noodles someone had thrown away. I called him inside, gave him a proper meal, then gave him a job." Tessa sat still, listening. "I taught him to drive because he didn't know how. I gave him a room because he had nowhere to sleep. I trusted him because he had no one but me. And I thought a person with no one would never betray the only person who gave him everything." Knox took another sip of coffee. "I thought wrong." Silence. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind of silence between two people, when one is opening something they don't open for anyone, and the other is holding the space so that thing has somewhere to exist. Tessa said softly, "Are you angry because you lost Perry? Or because you realized you trusted the wrong person?" Knox looked up. For the first time that night, he looked straight into Tessa's eyes. Both. Tessa nodded. Then she said, "I trusted the wrong person too. 3 years. I trusted that Craig would see what I did. I trusted that if I gave enough, he would value it. I was wrong, but if I stopped trusting anyone because of Craig, I'd never be sitting here. I wouldn't have taken the job in this mansion. I wouldn't have stayed to take Margaret's blood pressure at 9 o'clock at night, because I wouldn't have trusted enough to believe that what I was doing mattered." She paused. "If you stop trusting, you'll live alone forever, Knox, and you've lived alone long enough." Knox was silent. For a long time. Then he said, so softly it was almost a whisper, "You sound like my mother." Tessa took a sip of water. "Maybe that's why she likes me." No one laughed, but the air in the kitchen became a little lighter. Tessa sat there for another 10 minutes. She didn't say anything more. Neither did Knox. Then she stood, washed her cup, placed it on the rack, and went up the stairs. Her footsteps were soft. The kitchen was silent again. Knox sat there a while longer. Then he washed his coffee cup, placed it beside the cup Tessa had just washed, turned off the light, and went upstairs to his room. The next morning, Margaret called Knox into her room. She was sitting in the armchair beside the window, where she always sat, her back straight, both hands resting in her lap. Tessa had gone out to pick up new medication from the pharmacy. "Close the door," Margaret said. Knox closed the door, sat down on the edge of the bed, facing his mother. Margaret looked at her son. For a long time, the way only mothers who had lived through great loss could look at their children. The kind of look that went through the hard shell her son had built over the past 14 years and saw straight into the 19-year-old boy standing in a hospital, hearing that his father wouldn't survive. "I know about Perry," she said. Knox didn't ask how she knew. Margaret always knew everything that happened in this mansion. She didn't need anyone to tell her. She only needed to listen to the way people stayed silent. "Your father died because I didn't see the traitor sitting right beside him," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't weak, only slower than usual, because she was speaking about something she had carried for 20 years and had never fully said aloud. "I lived with that guilt for 20 years, Knox. For 20 years, I looked at the chair your father used to sit in and wondered, if I had been sharper, if I had seen it sooner, would your father still be here?" Knox tightened his hands on his thighs. He didn't speak. "But that girl, Tessa," Margaret continued. "She saw Perry before you did. She, a nurse who had been here less than a month, sat down and recorded every day, every hour, compared every detail, moved my room down to the first floor to break a plan she wasn't even certain existed. She did what I couldn't do 20 years ago. She has the eyes that neither you nor I had." Margaret stopped, breathed, slowly. Her heart didn't allow her to speak for long, but she wasn't finished. "Your father loved me, truly loved me, but your father couldn't protect me, because he didn't see the traitor. Just as I didn't. Two people loved each other, but they were both blind to danger." She looked at Knox. "You have a chance to do differently. You have someone who can see what you don't. Don't waste that." Knox sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his mother. He didn't say, "I understand," because he didn't understand all of it yet. He didn't say, "Yes," because he wasn't a man who said yes. He only nodded. Once. Slightly. But Margaret saw it, and she knew that was all she needed. The doctor kept Tessa in the hospital for 2 days to monitor her shoulder and check whether the scrape on her forehead had caused any complications. Tessa didn't like being hospitalized. She was used to taking care of other people, not being taken care of. But she stayed because the doctor required it, and because she knew her body needed time, even if her mind didn't want to admit it. On the first evening, Knox came. No warning, no knock. He stepped into the hospital room, pulled the plastic chair beside the bed closer, sat down, opened a report on his phone, and read, as if he were sitting in his own office. Only the chair was harder, and the lights were brighter. Tessa looked at him. "You don't need to be here." Knox didn't look up. "I know. No explanation. No more. No less." He sat there until 11 o'clock at night, then left. On the second evening, he came again. The same chair, the same posture, the same report on his phone. Tessa didn't say anything anymore. She understood that Knox hadn't come because she was weak. He had come because it was the only way he knew to say something he didn't know how to put into words. 3 o'clock in the morning on the second night, Tessa woke because her shoulder hurt. She shifted, opened her eyes, and saw Knox still sitting in the chair. But he had fallen asleep. His head was tilted slightly to the left, his back still straight even though his shoulders had loosened. His phone was still in his hand, the screen still lit. Tessa looked closer. On the screen wasn't a report. It was a camera feed. The camera in Margaret's room at the mansion. The image was dark, but clear. Margaret was asleep, the blanket pulled up to her chest, the bedside lamp turned off. Even while dozing in a hospital room beside Tessa, Knox was still watching over his mother. Tessa lay there and looked at Knox for a while. The man the whole city didn't dare look straight in the eye was sleeping on a plastic hospital chair, his phone open to the camera in his mother's room, his face more tired than she had ever seen it. She realized he was more like her than she had thought. He was also someone who stayed awake at 3 o'clock in the morning because of someone else. He was also someone who carried burdens without telling anyone. His world was different. His tools were different, but the core was the same. They were both people who didn't know how to stop, because they were afraid that if they stopped, no one else would continue. Tessa sat up gently. She took the thin blanket from the foot of her bed, stood, and draped it over Knox, softly, carefully, so she wouldn't wake him. Knox didn't wake. His shoulder twitched slightly when the fabric touched him, but he stayed asleep. Tessa stood there for one more second, Then she went back to bed, lay down, and closed her eyes. For the first time, she had taken care of someone who wasn't a patient. And it was different, completely different. That same day, at the mansion, Knox picked Miles up from Gail's house to play. Miles knew his mother had gone to see the doctor and would be back soon. The boy didn't ask many questions. At 4 years old, his world was bicycles, stuffed dinosaurs, and crayons. Knox brought Miles into Margaret's room because she wanted to meet the boy, and because Knox didn't know what to do with a child of 4, except take him to someone who did. Miles sat on the floor of Margaret's room, crayons spread around him, a sheet of white paper laid wide in front of him. He drew. Seriously. His tongue stuck out to one side because he was concentrating. A house. A sun. 2 people standing beside each other in front of the door. One tall, one short. Under the tall person, the boy wrote in crooked letters, "Mommy," under the short one, "Me." Knox stood beside him, both hands in his trouser pockets, looking down at the drawing. Margaret sat in her armchair, watching. Miles looked up at Knox. Then the boy picked up a blue crayon and held it out to him. "Draw yourself in." Knox looked at the crayon, looked at Miles, looked at the picture with the house, the sun, and 2 people. Knox Hartwell, the man who ran an entire empire with calm and absolute power, was standing in his mother's room, being handed a crayon by a 4-year-old child, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. He took the crayon, sat down on the floor beside Miles, and drew a third figure, standing beside Mommy and me, a little taller than the other 2, drawn with an unsteady line because Knox's hand was used to holding many things, but it had never held a crayon before. Margaret watched the scene from her armchair. She said nothing, but her hand moved to her chest, lightly, over her heart, and she kept it there for a very long time. Tessa was discharged on the 3rd day. Her shoulder hurt less, and the scrape on her forehead had begun to heal. She returned to the mansion to work, returned to taking Margaret's blood pressure every morning, returned to the plate of rye bread at 2:45 in the afternoon. Everything went back to normal, or almost normal, because Perry was no longer there, and the empty space he had left behind had not yet been filled by anyone. Knox was busier. The assistant was busier. The guards watched more tightly, but inside the mansion, in Margaret's room, Tessa still worked as though nothing had happened, because Margaret needed stability, and Tessa was the only one left who knew how to create that stability. Then Tessa's phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, while she was recording Margaret's blood sugar reading after lunch. An unknown number. She answered. "Excuse me? Is this Tessa Grant?" "Yes. I'm a nurse in the emergency department at St. Francis Hospital. We're treating Dorothy Palmer, 66 years old. She was admitted an hour ago with symptoms of mild anaphylactic shock. Mrs. Palmer asked us to contact you." Tessa stopped writing. "How is she?" "Her condition is stable, but we need to confirm her medical history. The family member with her is Mr. Craig Palmer, but he isn't able to provide complete information about her medications and allergy history." "Mrs. Palmer said you're the only one who knows her medical file." Tessa closed her eyes for 1 second. 4 months. She had left the Palmer house 4 months ago. And Craig still didn't know the medications his mother took. Still didn't know what his mother was allergic to. Still the same man standing in an emergency room, unable to provide even the most basic information. "Let me speak with the attending doctor," Tessa said. 15 seconds later, the doctor came on the line. His voice was quick, concise, in the middle of a shift. "Miss Grant, Mrs. Palmer is in mild anaphylactic shock. Suspected medication reaction. Mr. Palmer says he gave her medication according to the prescription, but he doesn't clearly remember the name. I need to confirm her current medication list, allergy history, and any drug interactions we should note." Tessa answered. She didn't open a notebook, didn't look anything up. She didn't need to. Dorothy Palmer is taking 11 medications, including metoprolol 50 milligrams twice a day for heart failure, lisinopril 10 milligrams once a day, metformin 500 milligrams twice a day for type 2 diabetes, and atorvastatin 20 milligrams every evening. She is allergic to sulfonamide and penicillin. She has cross-reactivity with sulfonylurea. If Mr. Palmer gave her glipizide instead of metformin, that is the cause of the anaphylactic shock, because glipizide belongs to the sulfonylurea class, and she is allergic to the sulfa base. Silence for 2 seconds on the other end of the line. "Correct," the doctor said. Mr. Palmer reported that he bought a substitute medication at the pharmacy because metformin was out, and the pharmacy recommended glipizide. He didn't know about the sulfa allergy. Dorothy needs epinephrine if she hasn't been given it yet. Blood pressure monitoring every 15 minutes for the next 2 hours, and she shouldn't be given any other medication until her readings are stable. Her most recent blood sugar reading before I left 4 months ago was 132 while fasting. She tends to have low blood sugar at night if she doesn't eat a light snack before 9 o'clock. Thank you, Miss Grant. This information is very important. The doctor hung up. Tessa sat still. The phone was still pressed to her ear even though the line had already ended. Margaret looked at her from the armchair. She didn't ask. She saw Tessa's face, and she understood that this was a piece of the old life Tessa thought she had left behind. 20 minutes later, Tessa's phone rang again. This time, it wasn't the nurse. It wasn't the doctor. It was Dorothy. Her voice was weak, slow, but clear. "Tessa, I'm here, Mom. You just saved me again." Dorothy paused, breathed. "And you weren't even here." Tessa bit her lip hard. She didn't answer, because if she opened her mouth now, her voice would break. Dorothy continued, slowly, word by word. "I'm sorry, Tessa. I owed you those words a long time ago. I saw everything. Every morning you woke up at 5:45. Every pill you set out on the nightstand beside my bed. Every time you checked my blood sugar and wrote it in the notebook with 3 colors of ink. Every afternoon you cooked slow-cooked oatmeal because you knew the instant kind wasn't good for me. Every Thursday you took me to my appointments without missing a single one. I saw all of it, Tessa, from the first day to the day you walked out the door." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Tessa asked, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. Silence for 3 seconds. "Because I was afraid." Dorothy's voice trembled for the first time. "I was afraid that if I said Craig was wrong, I would lose my son. I was afraid that if I stood on your side, Craig would never come back. I was afraid of losing my only child, so I stayed silent. I watched you do everything, and I didn't say a word." She stopped. Her breathing grew heavy. "And my silence cost me my daughter-in-law." Tessa couldn't hold it back anymore. Tears ran down her face, without sound, like that first night at Gail's house, when Miles slept beside her and she only allowed herself to cry where no one could see. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't crying because she had lost something. She was crying because she had been seen. After 4 months, after 3 years, at last, someone had said the words she had needed to hear for so long. "I saw you. I saw all of it. And I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner." Margaret sat in the armchair, watching Tessa cry. She didn't stand. She didn't say anything. She only reached to her right, picked up the tissue box from the table, and gently placed it on Tessa's lap. Tessa took it, pulled out a tissue, wiped her eyes. 2 women sat in the room. One had just heard the thing she had waited 3 years to hear. The other understood exactly what that felt like, because she too had waited a very long time for someone to sit beside her, whom she didn't want to send away. 1 week after the call from Dorothy, everything at the Hartwell mansion moved steadily again. Tessa maintained her full work schedule without any reminders of her past injuries. Taking Margaret's blood pressure every morning, bringing the plate of bread at 2:45 in the afternoon, and recording blood sugar readings 3 times a day. Everything moved steadily again. But there was one thing that had changed, and she could feel it even though no one said it out loud. Knox appeared more often. There were more guards around the mansion, and one afternoon, Knox called Tessa into his office. He sat behind the desk, no report in his hand, no phone, only Knox, both hands placed on the tabletop, looking at Tessa with the eyes of someone who had thought for a very long time before opening his mouth. "I want you and Miles to move into the mansion. Here. Long term." Tessa stood in front of the desk. She didn't sit. "No." Knox didn't blink, but his shoulder twitched slightly, so slightly that only someone used to observing small details would notice. He wasn't used to being refused. She knew that. But she also knew she needed to speak. "I just escaped a man who controlled my life for 3 years, Knox. He decided where I lived, what I did, how I lived. He called it marriage. I'm not walking into another cage, even if this cage is prettier, bigger, and has guards at the gate. I'm not controlling you," Knox said, his voice lower than usual. "I'm protecting you. Protection and control. The line is very thin." Tessa looked at Knox. She didn't look away, didn't lower her head. The same way she had looked at him on the first day in the conference room. You decided I should live here. You arranged security around my mother's house without telling me. You had your lawyer handle my situation. You called my ex-husband without asking me. Everything you did was for the right reason, but each of those things was also you deciding for me. She stopped. Craig also thought everything he did was for me. And he was wrong. The room went silent. Knox sat behind the desk, looking at Tessa, and for the first time she saw something on his face that she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not offense. He was listening. Truly listening. The kind of listening people only do when they realize the person across from them is speaking a truth they need to hear, even if they don't want to. Then what do you want? Knox asked. His voice wasn't cold. It wasn't warm either. It was simply real. I want to decide for myself, Tessa said. If I stay because I choose to, not because you keep me. If one day I want to leave, you let me leave. No calling security, no calling lawyers, no calling anyone. You let me go. Knox was silent, longer than any silence Tessa had ever witnessed from him, because this wasn't a business decision. It wasn't an order to a subordinate. This was a man who had held on to everything his entire life, being asked to accept that he could lose. All right, Knox said. One word, but she saw his hand tighten beneath the table when he said it. 2 weeks later, Tessa received a call from a major hospital in another city. They needed a cardiovascular specialty nurse, an official position, stable pay, full benefits, a safe job, far from the underground world, far from the mansion, far from Knox. Gail said, You should go. It's safer. Tessa thought for 3 days. Then she went to Margaret's room. Margaret was reading. Tessa sat down in the small chair beside the bed, the place where she always sat. I have a chance to leave. A good job. Stable. Safe. Margaret lowered her book, looked at Tessa, for a long time, then said, Then go. Tessa was surprised. You don't want me to stay? I do, Margaret said, her voice soft but clear. But I don't keep people by making them feel guilty for leaving. I've lived long enough to learn that. If you want to go, go. I'll find another nurse. Maybe the 8th one will last 3 weeks. Tessa looked at her. Margaret looked back. And in Margaret's eyes, Tessa saw what the older woman didn't say. She wanted her to stay, but she respected her enough not to hold her. I'm staying, Tessa said. Margaret didn't move, but her hand tightened slightly around the book. Not because you need me, Tessa continued, but because this is the first place where I've been seen. The real me. Not the work I do, not how many pills I know by heart, or how many readings I record. Me. You saw me. And that is something I've been searching for longer than a stable job. Margaret nodded, once, then picked up her book and turned to a new page. My afternoon medication is at 6:15. Don't forget it because you're busy being emotional. Tessa smiled, softly. For the first time, she smiled in Margaret's room. That evening, Knox found Tessa in the first-floor hallway, just after she had finished checking Margaret's room. He stood beside the window, hands in his trouser pockets, looking out at the yard. Tessa stood beside him, silent. Knox spoke first. He didn't look at her. He looked into the darkness outside. I don't know how to say these things. My world didn't teach me how to speak. But my mother was right. I have a chance to do differently. And I want to do differently. He turned to Tessa. I want you to be the person I protect. Not because you're weak. You aren't weak. You're stronger than most people I've ever met. I want to protect you because you deserve to be protected. And because I want to be the one who does it. Tessa looked at Knox. He was looking at her, and for the first time, his eyes weren't keeping their distance. There was no wall between them now. Only a man telling the truth to a woman he trusted not to use it against him. Tessa didn't answer with words. She reached out and took Knox's hand. Lightly, briefly, then let go. Don't forget Margaret's evening medication at 6:15, she said, and walked away. Knox stayed by the window, watching Tessa walk down the hallway. His hand, the one she had just held, remained exactly where it was. He didn't close it, didn't lower it. He only held it there, as if he wanted to remember that feeling for a few seconds longer. 6 months later, Tessa lived in a small apartment 10 minutes by car from the Hartwell mansion. The apartment had been arranged by Knox, but Tessa paid the monthly rent from her own salary. She had insisted on that from the first day, and Knox hadn't objected, because he had learned that Tessa didn't accept anything she hadn't earned for herself. Miles rode his bicycle in the mansion courtyard every Sunday afternoon. He was 5 years old now, taller, faster, and still hugged his stuffed dinosaur every night before going to sleep. He pedaled around the flower bed, then stopped in front of the first-floor balcony, looked up, and shouted, "Uncle Knox, look at me!" Knox stood on the balcony, his hands in his trouser pockets, and nodded. He didn't clap. He didn't shout back. He only nodded. But Miles smiled wide, because the boy had learned that with Uncle Knox, a nod meant very good. Margaret sat in the armchair beside the window of her first-floor room, looking out at the yard. Her health was more stable than it had been 6 months earlier. Her blood sugar was well controlled. Her blood pressure was within range. Her medication dosage had been corrected ever since Tessa discovered the wrong dose on her first day, and her body had responded well. On the refrigerator in the mansion kitchen, a new notebook hung by a magnet. Hard cover, neat handwriting, 3 colors of ink. Tessa had written this notebook during her first month at the mansion, the same way she had written the notebook for Dorothy 3 years before. But this time, the notebook stayed, and the person who wrote it stayed too. Knox stood beside Tessa on the balcony, watching Miles ride his bicycle. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. There were afternoons when each other's presence was enough, and this was one of those afternoons. Tessa looked at Miles laughing, looked down at Margaret watching from her window, looked at Knox beside her, and she thought. She didn't regret the 3 years she had spent with the Palmer family. She didn't regret a single morning waking up at 5:45. She didn't regret a single pill she had placed on the nightstand beside Dorothy's bed. She didn't regret the slow-cooked oatmeal, the blood sugar readings written in 3 colors of ink, the Thursday afternoons sitting in the hospital waiting room for 4 straight hours. She had done all of it with real love, the kind of love that didn't need anyone to see it in order to exist. The kind of love that woke before dawn and did the right thing without waiting for anyone to say thank you. But when that love wasn't recognized, when the person she had given herself to chose to turn his back, she had walked away. No resentment, no revenge, just walked away. And that step, the step she had thought meant losing everything, turned out to be the first step that brought her to a place where everything she did was seen, valued, by a sharp-eyed mother who didn't easily say, "Sit down," by a powerful man who didn't easily say, "You deserve it," and by the child who had held out a crayon at 4 years old and said, "Draw yourself in. Your worth doesn't depend on whether someone sees it. You don't become less because the person beside you fails to notice what you do. But life becomes fairer when you dare to leave a place that isn't worthy of you. Sometimes losing everything isn't the end. Sometimes it is the way life clears the old road so it can open the path that leads you to the place where you truly belong. A place where you don't need to explain how much you are worth, because the people there saw it from the very first day." If this story touched you, please hit like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the things they do in silence are always seen by someone. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment and share with us the feelings from deep inside your heart. We read every comment and cherish every story you tell. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the notification bell so you won't miss new stories every day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful, calm days. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.